In this video, we're going to talk about system cases and motherboards. One of the decisions you might make when purchasing a new computer is how big or what type of system case you might want. We're going to take a look at some of the differences and similarities between the cases and the motherboards that fit inside those cases. Probably the most common system case type is the tower. However, each of these computers here might be classified as a tower computer. While there are some standard terminologies used with the computer cases, they may differ from manufacturer to manufacturer. This computer, for example, would definitely be classified as a full tower because of its size. It has 4 expansion slots on the top for CD and DVD drives and other components. However, this computer next to it that is smaller in size would probably still be classified as a full tower. It again has 4 expansion slots here with additional slots down below. One difference between the bigger one and the smaller one is that the bigger one has more internal locations for hard drives and other devices. In fact, that's one of the biggest considerations when choosing between case sizes is the number of slots and the number of devices you would like to add to those cases. If both of these cases are classified as full tower cases, another case that might be a step down, perhaps about this high, would be classified as a mid or a mini tower case. If you can imagine this case about half its size, and it would have 1 or 2 expansion slots. Slimline cases would be about half the size divided this way in the case. In that case, a DVD drive, for instance, here would be turned sideways. A slimline case may also be turned sideways on a desk to hold a monitor on top of the case. The case on the end is often called a small form factor or SFF case. These are more custom cases that are intended to give you a smaller computer that you can put in small areas such as kitchens or maybe computers that are somewhat portable. In this case, I have a single large expansion slot for my DVD and a smaller one for a floppy drive. I've also seen cases such as this be classified as mini tower computers, although they're really just a box computer. There are also computers that are small form factors that might be balls, or even computers that are integrated within a monitor. It might seem like a simple decision to simply choose the case that you want. Do I want a big computer or a small computer? And in reality it is. However, there's one important consideration you need to be aware of. When choosing the case size, you need to take into consideration the size of the motherboard that will fit inside of that case. They need to match. So if you choose a small computer, you obviously need a smaller motherboard. Or on the other hand, if you have a small system case and you want to replace the motherboard, you need to make sure you get the right size and type to fit into the system case you already have. The size of the motherboard is often called the form factor, and there are several standard form factors for motherboards. Let's take a look at several of these. Probably the most common form factor for a motherboard is the ATX form factor. The board is approximately 12 inches by 9 inches, and you can see here the slots for the expansion cards. The form factor identifies the size of the circuit board, the location of the slots, as well as the location of the faceplate that comes out the back of the computer. The form factor also identifies the location of the holes that are used to mount the motherboard into the system case. The full tower case that we looked at would be able to accommodate an ATX motherboard. In fact, that large case that we saw has more than enough room to fit an ATX motherboard. The next motherboard size down is a micro ATX. It is similar in size to the full ATX, but notice that the board is a little shorter. Notice how the face plates line up to the exact same position. And if I were to position these motherboards on top of each other, you should be able to see that the holes on the motherboard line up exactly. So whereas the micro ATX motherboard is slightly smaller than the ATX motherboard, a system case that will hold an ATX motherboard can also hold a micro ATX motherboard. The smaller mid or mini tower cases would likely be too small for a full ATX motherboard, but should accommodate a micro ATX motherboard. Going down in size, we have a mini ITX motherboard. Notice how there is a single expansion slot, and the motherboard itself is considerably smaller than the ATX and even the micro ATX. However, you should notice that the faceplates still line up. And if I position the holes, the hole positions, although there are fewer holes, they still match the ATX hole positions. So I could theoretically take this micro ITX motherboard and place it inside a full tower case. More than likely, however, I'm going to use a small form factor case for this motherboard. The ATX form factor and its variations, the micro ATX and even the mini ITX, are the most common motherboard form factors. Another form factor you need to be aware of is the BTX form factor. There are a few main differences you should notice about the BTX form factor. In this case, I have the motherboard plate facing towards you, and you should notice that the motherboard plate is on the opposite end. The ATX motherboard had the mother plate on this side, whereas the BTX has a motherboard plate on this side. Another difference is that the hole positions are different in a BTX board than an ATX board. And the thing you should notice right off is the processor socket is slightly rotated so that it is at an angle to the system board. Remember, the ATX had the motherboard socket square, kind of like this is square, whereas the BTX now has rotated the processor slightly. This rotation is to aid in the airflow across the processor so that you get more surface area and to assist in cooling the processor. The BTX motherboard will only fit within a system case that is designed for a BTX motherboard. In many cases, this means that an ATX system case will not work with a BTX system board, although there are system cases that are able to accommodate both the ATX and the BTX form factors. Again, one of the major considerations is the position of the holes on the motherboard, as well as the location of the faceplate and additional modifications that were necessary for the processor. One final form factor you need to be aware of is the NLX form factor. One of the things you should notice about this motherboard is that there are no expansion slots for the PCI or ISA bus. The NLX form factor is used in slimline cases that are very short. They would only be a few inches tall in the system case, and therefore there is not sufficient room to have expansion cards such as this plugging into the motherboard. Instead, you want a shorter case that would be shorter than the expansion cards. In order to accommodate those expansion cards, you instead use a tab on the edge of the motherboard. You then insert a riser card on the end of the motherboard. This riser card is then used for your expansion cards, so that now expansion cards lay flat rather than being perpendicular to the motherboard. The NLX is an older style motherboard that is not used very often. You might see it in some older motherboards, but you're rarely likely to encounter it in newer motherboards. When choosing a system case and the motherboard form factor, other than considering the size of the computer that you want, the most important factor is to match the motherboard form factor with the form factor supported by the system case. The ATX motherboard is the most common form factor. It has the most expansion slots for PCI or PCI Express or AGP expansion slots. Micro ATX is a bit smaller, with mini ITX being even smaller, often with a single expansion card slot. The ATX, micro ATX, and mini ITX are all compatible within the same system case, as long as the case is big enough to accommodate the board. Obviously, a small form factor case will not be large enough for an ATX motherboard. However, a full tower case can accommodate all three sizes. A BTX motherboard has the processor slot rotated, and the motherboard faceplate is in a different location than the ATX motherboard. In addition, the mounting holes for the BTX are in a different location than on the ATX motherboard. So system cases designed for BTX motherboards often do not work with ATX motherboards. Finally, the NLX motherboard is used in slimline or half-height computers. The motherboard uses a riser card slot for mounting the expansion cards parallel to the motherboard. This saves on space, allowing slimmer computers to be designed.